Hello and welcome to Trails Worth Hiking, the show that brings you some of the most interesting backpacking and trekking routes in the world. I'm your host, Jeremy Pendry. In the first part of the show, we bring you the story and history of a trail. Then we tell you what it's like to hike the trail and how you can do it. On this episode, we go back to the desert, to an otherworldly landscape in a massive national park, where we'll find solitude traversing a loop hike that is partly on dirt roads and partly an off-trail route through narrow canyons, where we'll hike through a unique landscape in one of America's most fascinating and dramatic deserts, as we travel the Cottonwood-Marble Canyon Loop in Death Valley National Park in California. Welcome to the show, everyone. Thank you for joining me. Let's start with our Walking the Walk segment, where we highlight listeners who have hiked a trail after listening to an episode about it and were inspired to hike the trail by the show. On this episode, I want to highlight Jonty Crane, who hiked the Manaslu Circuit and Sum Valley, which we covered in episode 15 about Tony Wong and me hiking this trek in Nepal. Jonty was our guest on the episode about the Snowman Trek, which I think was episode 62. Anyway, Jonty has done a lot of hiking in the Himalayas and gave the Manaslu Circuit in Sum Valley a shot and just finished it in November of 2025 as I'm recording shortly after that. And one thing I want to note is that Jonty reports that this trek has become much more popular than when I did it. There are about 15,000 people a year now who do the Manaslu Circuit. Just for comparison's sake, I think Everest Base Camp is about 40,000 a year. The Annapurna Circuit is about 30,000. But when I went in 2019, I think it was only between 2,000 and 3,000 trekkers a year who did the Manaslu Circuit. So it is no longer a secluded trek. It is no longer a hidden gem, just a regular old gem. Jonty reports that the tea houses were full and that in some of the villages there were more tea houses than local houses, which means they've built quite a bit of infrastructure since I've been there. Obviously, it's still great scenery and there's wonderful Buddhist sites, particularly in the Sum Valley, which Jonty enjoyed. But the hike is no longer a secret, and that's because it is a worthwhile destination. And I guess this is just a reminder that things are always changing. So always do your research and get current information before heading out to do one of the hikes we've covered on the show, particularly if it's an episode that was several years ago. In any event, congratulations to Jonty Crane. We are at the end of 2025, here in December 2025, and I want to highlight a couple of possible gifts you might get for friends and family who are interested in hiking or backpacking or trekking. There are a couple of 2026 calendars I want to mention that might be worth checking out. One is called 2026 Walks of the World. It's a desk calendar, so a daily calendar. It covers 25 epic treks and multi-day hikes. There are multiple days on each trek, which is why you can have a daily calendar that covers 25 treks and not 365. So this calendar was put together by Gail Perry, and you can find it at Gail Perry Treks, GailPerry, GailPerryTreks.com. It offers a look inside some of the world's most loved multi-day hikes. It features primarily well-marked hut-to-hut style hikes rather than wilderness camping routes. There are photos, descriptions, itineraries, tips, and advice. A few examples of the treks covered are the Queen Charlotte Track in New Zealand, the Pekoi Trail in Sri Lanka, and the Kerry Way in Ireland. It's available, as I said, through Gail's website, but you can also find it on Amazon. I also want to mention the Christian Paul Photography 2026 monthly calendar. Christian is a former two-time guest on the show and a fantastic photographer, and his 2026 monthly calendar has photos from the High Uintas Wilderness and the Wasatch Range in Utah. If you love the mountains of the American West, check out christianpaulphotography.com to take a look and buy the calendar. All right. On this episode, our guest is William Armstrong. He is a backpacker and a photographer. You can see his work at wta.photography. I'll leave a link in the show notes. He hiked the Cottonwood-Marble Canyon Loop with his brother. I believe it was in 2021. So why am I covering a hike in Death Valley? I've been to Death Valley twice. I've car camped and day hiked there, but I've never backpacked there. Death Valley is an absolutely fascinating and captivating place. It's an extreme climate. I was once there in April, and I think it was about 104 degrees Fahrenheit. The second time I was there were high winds, which was interesting. It has a wide range of elevation, as we'll talk about. There's everything from salt flats to sand dunes to slot canyons to volcanic craters to high desert mountains. It is such a unique and harsh landscape that I thought we had to do an episode on it. Death Valley is in southeastern California. It's in the northern Mojave Desert, bordering the Great Basin Desert of Nevada. During summer, it is believed to be the hottest place on Earth. In 1913, at Furnace Creek in Death Valley, the temperature recorded was 134 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 56.7 degrees Celsius, and it's the hottest temperature ever recorded on Earth. There is some controversy over the accuracy of the instruments at that time, but nonetheless, that was the temperature recorded. Badwater Basin in Death Valley is a salt flat, and it's the lowest elevation in the United States. It's 282 feet, or 86 meters below sea level. What's really interesting is it's only about 85 miles from Mount Whitney, which is the highest point in the contiguous United States at over 14,500 feet or thereabouts. One cool thing is that there's the Badwater Ultramarathon that goes from Badwater to Mount Whitney, but it goes to Whitney Portal, not the top of the mountain, but to the entrance to the trail that goes up Mount Whitney. And Whitney Portal is at more than 8,000 feet in elevation. So you go from below zero, essentially, in elevation to over 8,000 feet, over 135 miles, or about 217 kilometers, on the Badwater Ultramarathon. Death Valley is in a valley between the Amargosa Range to the east and the Panamint Range to the west. Telescope Peak in the Panamint Range is over 11,000 feet in elevation. It's the highest point in the park. The valley is about 3,000 square miles, or 7,800 square kilometers. How it got its name is an interesting story. Although a name like Death Valley makes sense for such an inhospitable place, it was actually a group of pioneers from Salt Lake City that were coming through the area in the winter of 1849-1850 that gave the valley its name. They came through to avoid the winter in the Sierra Nevada farther north, where the Donner Party tragedy had recently happened. And they were following the old Spanish Trail, supposedly to go around the mountains. They came through on a wagon train. Ultimately, they had a dispute about which way to go and split into two groups. They were trying to find a shortcut through Walker Pass to get through the Sierra. They eventually made it to a salt flat, but there was no water there. And then they had some luck where a snowstorm came through, which provided water. And ultimately, both groups ended up in Death Valley. One group succeeded by abandoning their wagons. They even slaughtered and ate their oxen, I believe, and ended up crossing on foot to civilization in the West. The other group sent two people ahead for help and set up camp and waited. Those two people eventually made it back with supplies, but one person had died in the interim while they were waiting. As the story goes, when they were leaving finally, one of the women turned back and said, "Goodbye, Death Valley," thus giving the valley its name. Ironically, in the Pleistocene era, which ended about 10,000 years ago, the valley was filled with a massive lake, Lake Manly, which was 100 miles long and 600 feet deep. Its evaporation is responsible for the salt flats that are there today. So Death Valley wasn't always as dry and desolate as these pioneers who came through found it, but it is extremely dry there today. It's in the rain shadow of the Sierra Nevada and the Panamint mountain ranges to the west. The shape and depth of the valley and its sparse vegetation contribute to the extreme heat. And I don't fully understand this part, but there is sort of a recirculation effect, I think because of the shape of the valley, where hot air gets pushed in sort of a circle and back down that makes it even hotter. There's very low average rainfall of only 1.5 inches or 38 millimeters. Despite the heat and lack of water, and the ominous name for the valley, there are plants and animals that live there, and even native peoples who have lived there for a long time. There are actually hundreds of springs and ponds in the area, and near some of them are willows and cottonwood trees, as you'll hear about in discussing our featured hike. There can be incredible wildflower blooms in late winter or early spring, or even later spring in the higher elevations, following winters that have above average rain. These are the so-called super blooms. The last one was in 2016. There are bighorn sheep, there's red-tailed hawks, and there's even feral horses and donkeys left over from mining times. And yes, there are several varieties of rattlesnake, which is California's venomous snake, including the Mojave rattlesnake and sidewinders. But there are also non-venomous king snakes and gopher snakes. Salt Creek in the middle of the valley even has a native fish, the Death Valley pupfish. As I said, people have also lived in the valley a long time as well. In fact, for about 10,000 years, there have been several different peoples that have come and gone. Most recently, though, the Timbisha people, a nomadic people formerly called the Panamint Shoshone, have lived there for at least 1,000 years. Some Timbisha families still live there at Furnace Creek in Death Valley. It's a very small tribe in total number. It's not known exactly how many there were historically, but it's believed to be not very many, and by the 20th century, only a few hundred. White miners and ranchers came to the area in the late 19th century, and they eventually restricted access to the springs that they were using, which further marginalized the Timbisha. All that said, the tribe has survived, and they were formally recognized in 1982 and given a tiny 40-acre reservation in the valley, and the tribe currently consists of about 300 members. There's been mining in the area since the late 19th century, with prospecting for gold and silver, but the most successfully extracted mineral in the area has been borax, which was discovered in 1881, and borax is used mostly for cleaning and laundry products. The borax mines became famous for the 20-mule teams that were used to haul the borax out of the valley. But in Death Valley itself, that boom didn't last long, though even today there are major borax mining operations south of Death Valley, which you can see from the highway when driving through the Mojave Desert on Highway 58 near the town of Boron. In that area, there's one of the world's largest open-pit borax mines. Because of the boom and bust cycle of prospecting and mining in Death Valley, there are several ghost towns in or near Death Valley. There's Panamint City, which was built as a result of a silver strike in 1874, but it was destroyed by a flood only 2 years later. There's Skidoo, which is a former gold mining town. There's Greenwater, a former copper mining town. And on the Nevada side, because you can enter the park from the east side at the border with Nevada, there's a ghost town called Rhyolite, which was the result of a 1905 gold rush. It was built near the Montgomery Shoshone mine, which was owned by industrialist Charles Schwab, of all people. But the town quickly failed and the mine was closed by 1911. No discussion of the cultural and human history of Death Valley is complete without talking about Death Valley Scotty and Scotty's Castle. Walter Scott first visited Death Valley as part of a survey crew when he was only about 12 years old. And then at age 16, he joined the Buffalo Bill Cody show, which was a traveling sort of Western show. And he toured as a stunt rider for 12 years. Later, he got married and moved to Colorado and started a gold mine, but it wasn't a successful endeavor. Undeterred by that, he started a fictitious gold mine and ended up conning a wealthy New York City businessman to give him money. He was claiming that the mine was successful and gave false reports about its success, but just kept the money. And then at one point even claimed that he was coming to New York with a bag of gold to show his patron, but it was somehow stolen on the way, as he claimed. And this got him some headlines at the time. Later, he and his wife broke an LA to New York train speed record, where they traveled in a train from Los Angeles to New York, which again got him into the press. This helped him to keep conning additional investors into his fictitious mining operations. He was quite a self-promoter, as you can imagine. He even had a play about himself made that was performed, I think, in Seattle, that he starred in. He eventually got arrested for fraud, but he wasn't convicted and he carried on conning people. He even resorted to stealing gold from other actual gold mines, and at one point did go to jail for a period of time. Anyway, one of the people that Scotty had scammed, Albert Johnson, eventually became his good friend. And it was Johnson that eventually built a vacation home in Death Valley at Steininger Ranch. Scott claimed that he was in fact building it when he talked to people, and because of the scale, people thought he must have had a successful mine after all, rather than just a wealthy patron. The ranch became known as Scotty's Castle. Even after Johnson died and donated the house to a religious organization, his will allowed Scott to live there the rest of his life, which Scotty did until he died in 1954, and he's buried there above the castle. The house is a 2-story mission and Spanish colonial revival style mansion. It's in the northern part of Death Valley. Despite that I've been to Death Valley twice, I've never seen it. It was badly damaged by a flood in 2015, and my first time there was shortly after that. And then there was a fire that damaged the castle further in 2021. And when I went back to Death Valley earlier this year, actually, I didn't have time to see it. It's my understanding that the ability to see it and tour is much more limited now than before due to the flood and the fire. It probably won't surprise you to hear that a house with such a colorful past is supposedly haunted. If you want to see the house right now, you can do a virtual reality tour on the Death Valley Conservancy website, which I did in preparing this episode, and that was interesting to see. So that's the story of Death Valley Scotty and Scotty's Castle. Tourism in Death Valley began in the 1920s with a tent camp at Stovepipe Wells and a ranch shortly after that at Furnace Creek. President Hoover made Death Valley a national monument in 1933. At the time, it had over 2 million acres. It became a biosphere reserve in 1984, and then a national park in 1994 when it was expanded by an additional 1.3 million acres. As a result, Death Valley National Park is the largest national park in the contiguous United States. The Cottonwood-Marble Canyon Loop, the trail we are covering in this episode, is a hike through a series of 3 separate canyons. It goes through Cottonwood Canyon, which is a series of washes and rocky terrain. It goes through Dead Horse Canyon, which has some steep ups and downs. And eventually Marble Canyon, which is a narrow and colorful slot canyon with towering walls and striped rocks like you might find in other slot canyons. So you'll hear all about that when we jump into my conversation with William, which we'll do in a moment. But before we do that, I want to remind you to check out Outdoor Herbivore, our sponsor, at outdoorherbivore.com. Now is the perfect time to buy holiday gifts for the backpackers in your family who want great, delicious backpacking meals. These meals are vegetarian or vegan, but as I always say, you don't need to be vegetarian or vegan to really love them. They're easy to prepare, they're high in calories, they use quality ingredients, and right now you can get them at 10% off using the discount code TWH10P, TWH10P, as in trailsworthhiking 10%, to get 10% off your order at outdoorherbivore.com. Use the discount code now while it's still active. The original plan was to have it active through the end of the calendar year. I don't know yet whether we'll be keeping it beyond that or whether we'll have a different promotion. So check out Outdoor Herbivore at outdoorherbivore.com. Thanks again to Outdoor Herbivore for sponsoring the show. And with that, let's jump into my conversation with William Armstrong. William Armstrong, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Hi, it's great to be here.
So, William, you are a photographer who focuses, it seems like, on nature type of photography. Can you talk about that a little bit?
My photography is really pretty eclectic. I used to shoot for travel magazines prior to COVID, but between the magazine industry really taking a nosedive and just things changing after COVID, I've done a lot more commercial work recently, and I do some teaching. But yeah, I love wildlife photography, do a lot of landscape photography. It's something that can be a little bit difficult to do with backpacking just because you're having to carry the equipment with you. I usually take a DSLR with me, but just one lens, something really small. I mean, because you're adding 6-7 pounds of weight if you're really putting a nice lens and a nice body. So
how is your photography changed at all as you've become a backpacker? Because it seems like it's something that you've got into in the last several years, doing more backpacking trips.
Hmm.
Has that changed the kinds of things you're shooting, or is it more just taking a DSLR, with you when you go backpacking and getting a shot here and there?
It's changed it in the sense that, especially a lot of landscape photographers tend to photograph. I remember one time I was in Yosemite. There's a famous bridge with a view of Half Dome there, and there must have been 20 photographers lined up, all doing the same shot at the same time with tripods there. Backpacking has really got me to think, if you're out there, equipment wise, you might be limited, but it opens up such possibilities for getting deeper into nature and photographing it. So I think it's been a positive. I don't know if my back would tell you that from carrying this stuff around, but
Everybody's got to have their luxury items that they take with them on backpacking trips.
yeah,
And for some people,
yeah,
photography equipment is a big one. And for others, it's other kinds of things like fishing
yeah.
gear or something like that.
Yeah, and cell phones have made it so much easier to get really high quality images. The thing you're really missing out on is being able to get a big zoom and something really wide, and just the amount of pixels you can get on a professional camera.
So, speaking of picturesque locations, how did you hear about and decide to do the Cottonwood-Marble Canyon Loop in Death Valley?
My brother and I, he lives in Texas. He's my primary backpacking partner. He lives in Texas and I live in Minnesota. And we do these backpacking trips together. And usually the winter time works out best for most of our schedules. And in the winter, you're limited as to where you can go. If you don't want to deal with snow, most mountains are out of the question. And so we sort of zeroed in on Death Valley because it's almost prime time of year in January when we went to be in Death Valley, because you're not dealing with the heat. And we wanted to do a loop hike that would be very isolated, and it really was. We did it in the January of 2021, so COVID was still full effect at that time. And I think we flew into Las Vegas, as I recall. California, on the California side, was still in lockdown at that time when we did the hike, which made the park almost completely empty. So yeah, it was a great time to go, and it was fantastic hiking. And we both love desert hiking.
Yeah, it was pretty interesting at that time in 2020 and 2021. I had an experience like that too in 2020, where my son and I went on a backpacking trip where for several days we saw nobody else on the trail.
Hmm.
And it was, pretty deep into backcountry. And there were a lot of people who were starting to get out and do some more hiking because it was one of the few things you could do.
Yeah.
But I felt like a lot of people weren't traveling also. And so to get into sort of deep backcountry, long-term deep hiking like that, there really weren't that many people out there. And it was kind of a unique moment in history to get a chance
Yeah.
to really see some things. And you're talking about California, even though it's Death Valley and a big desert, it's
Yeah.
still the most populated state in the entire United States. And you
Exactly.
expect to see people, wherever you go. And it's pretty cool that you were able to take advantage of that moment to see this area.
Yeah, yeah, and even since then, I mean, it's good and bad. A lot more people backpack now than they did prior to the pandemic, which is good because it helps protect the park areas and things like that, get people more interested. But it does make the trails more crowded, makes permits a lot more difficult to secure.
So, talk about planning for this hike, because this is not your typical straightforward, follow the trail signs, well worn path in a loop. This requires a little bit more to figure out route finding a little bit and connecting some locations. How did you go about figuring out how to do this?
We really didn't know going into it. I do a lot of research, but going into it, we didn't know even how long the trail was going to be, because the Park Service says that there can be an extra 2.3 miles on either end based on how far you can get on the road. We were fortunate enough, we rented a four-wheel drive vehicle in Vegas, just a small SUV. And at that time when we went, you were able to take the road all the way into kind of where the loop starts. But from what we were told, that's not always the case. You might have to do an extra couple of miles, which would bring the hike up to around 30 miles. A road that may require a high clearance four-wheel drive vehicle to get out there. We were fortunate that the weather conditions and the road conditions were good. We didn't have to do that portion of it, because the road itself is not the most gorgeous part of the hike.
Hmm.
In fact, when you leave the main paved road there in Death Valley, the road getting out to the hike, it took us about an hour because we had to just drive 5 miles an hour on a very rutted dirt road. So if you had a big monster truck, I think it would be no problem. But if someone was to do the hike, I would suggest that they prepare for that extra mileage on either end.
And so were you looking mostly at like blog articles or online videos on YouTube, or what did you do to figure out how you were going to do this?
It's a combination of things. Blog articles were big, YouTube videos, although uh, from a lot of backpacking I've done, I found less information on this particular hike than a lot of the other ones I've seen. There just seemed to be less out there on them.
So talk a little bit about what this terrain is like. So Death Valley, I mean, some people know it as this desert with the lowest point in the United States in
Mm.
elevation, below sea level actually at certain parts. But other parts of Death Valley are actually fairly high in elevation and fairly mountainous. It has a really wide range of types of terrain. What is the terrain like on this particular loop?
It's really varied. You're going from slot canyons on one portion of it to higher elevations, colder elevations, and trailless for a portion of it. It shows on the maps that there's a trail, but I use Gaia GPS, and my brother uses all trails to navigate. And we got fairly lost on one portion of the hike. It's a lot of high scrub and desert and no discernible trail. It was challenging route finding. I definitely say that.
What did you end up doing when Gaia and all trails weren't sufficient or where they were conflicting or where it wasn't working out? Like, how did you navigate those particular situations?
We had a paper map with us that showed what we thought was a saddle that we had to go over to get down into an area called Dead Horse Point. And we just looked at that saddle because it was up higher and just hiked as straight as we could towards it. But I'm sure we snaked around a lot because, like I say, there was a lot of scrub vegetation going through that portion of the hike. It was about 5 miles, I think, if I look at my map. Yeah, about 5 miles where there was really no trail. And really throughout the hike, there's not much on the way of trail because when you're in the canyon bottoms, there's no trail, but you're on the bottom of the canyon, you're not going to get lost in a slot canyon.
I think that's important for people to hear what you were just describing about shooting for a particular saddle and knowing that that's what you're targeting, because I think a lot of people can over rely on their devices or over rely on All Trails or Gaia and not go back to some of the more common sense things. If you look at the map and you see that there's a saddle and you
Hmm.
got to get to the other side of the saddle and you're looking in front of you out in the desert and there's a saddle
Yeah.
and it's lining up with what you're trying to get to, I mean, that's your target and you can navigate based on that. And a
Yeah.
lot of people need to realize that those kinds of sort of common sense tools, I think, are really, really important when you're in an environment like this.
Yeah, I would say, initially when I started backpacking, I probably brought a paper map more than I do now. But I think on a trailless hike like that, I think having a backup, even if you have a couple of people each with their own devices and it's unlikely that both of them are going to fail, I think it's nice to have a backup that you can actually look at that's not electronic.
So you mentioned that you guys were looking for a winter hike, and this is a hike in winter. What month did you do the hike? And based on your understanding, what is the time range that you would recommend people consider doing this hike over?
We did the hike in early January of 2021. I would say this is a hike that you would want to do, like a lot of desert hikes, fall and spring, or you have the option for winter here. And I would say late fall or early spring, just because of the heat of Death Valley and the water sources. We read that your chances of finding water at the various springs were best around January, February time period. One of the three water sources that we had depended on actually was dry at that point. So I think trying to do it later in the spring, like you do something in Zion or something in April, May sort of time frame, might be difficult to do at Cottonwood-Marble.
In addition to the fact that there's really limited water, there's also the risk of the opposite of flash floods, right? In this, especially in a slot canyon.
Yeah, yeah, there is. We didn't have any precipitation when we were there, so it wasn't an issue. We did check the weather prior to going in. Also, I would recommend, I also have a little mini satellite communicator that I can get real-time weather updates. And I think that's also very helpful, especially when you're talking about an area that could end up flooding.
All right. So, what about temperature swings? Because desert is notorious for having very hot days, but sometimes very cold nights. What was that like in January?
The night was one of the coldest nights I've ever spent in the backcountry. Or a couple of nights we were there. It's wide open camping. You just have to be 100 feet from the water source. So we were about 100 or so feet from Cottonwood Springs, which is the one most reliable water source on that hike. In the morning, the spring's partially frozen over.
Wow.
It had gotten, below freezing at night. And when you had to get up to use the restroom in the middle of the night, you definitely felt that. So you almost became hypothermic right away. It was challenging. And then I would say the heat during the day was probably high 70s, but with a lot of radiation exposure because there are portions of the hike where you're going near cottonwoods and things where there's some shade. A lot of the hike is just wide open, so you're getting a lot of sun.
Okay, so we're not selling this entirely yet. We need to talk about the beauty. Talk about the beauty a little bit about what you're seeing out there. Why is it worth it to get out and do this?
Well, a couple of things. One of the major highlights is we saw wild horses on the hike.
Oh, cool.
Out there, we saw a big group of wild horses right near where we were camping, which is definitely a highlight. The Slot Canyon, Marble Canyon itself is really beautiful. And another thing about the hike is you more or less have it to yourself. The skies are gorgeous at night. If you're looking, at least when we did it, if you're looking to sort of get away from it all and not see other hikers, we saw 2 other hikers on the trail on the days that we were there.
So I've seen this listed as anywhere from a 2 to a 4-day hike. How long did it take you guys to do it, and what do you recommend for most people?
Our initial plan was to do 2 nights, 3 days on the trail. However, the third water source that we got to was too dry to really get anything out of at all. And so what we decided to do was on our second full day is to push and just complete the hike to get back to where we'd parked at the beginning of the hike and camp there our final night, our second night, instead of doing it actually on the trail. We ended up getting back to the car right about dark, and so just were able to set up the tent and get in there. I suppose it depends on how fast of a hiker you are. I mean, we did 13 miles a day for the 2 days. There's definitely some up and down on the hike. There's a dry fall that you have to navigate at one point. There's trail finding. So I would say at least 2 nights to do it, but possibly 3.
Okay, I like that option of getting back to the car and camping there because you don't have to plan to go anywhere from there, and you can have water in the car, which you're going to need.
Yeah.
That's actually a really interesting option, especially when you're out in the desert and there's nobody around. It's a beautiful place. Why not just camp?
Yeah, I'm not usually a big car camper, but something like that where you're just out there by yourself. Plus, the following day, we also on this trip, we wanted to do a night of backpacking at the Panamint Sand Dunes in Death Valley, which is another spectacular place. And we also figured that if we would have done where we had initially planned on camping and not back at the car, we wouldn't have time the next day to get out to the sand dunes and camp out there.
Okay. So other than standard backpacking gear, was there any particular gear that you needed to have that was special for this particular kind of terrain? I guess one thing that comes to mind is you want to have quite a bit of water capacity. And how much capacity did you have for water?
Capacity wise, I think we had enough to carry 8 liters, but we never carried more than 6 liters at any time.
Total or for each of you?
For each of us, yeah.
Wow, that's quite a bit. 6 liters per person is a lot.
Because from what the Park Service was saying, we didn't know that there would actually be water, and we thought, I mean, that's a lot of weight to carry in water, but we erred on the side of just making sure we had enough water.
Sure.
We were glad that we did on the second, on the day, basically the third point where there's supposed to be water, that there wasn't any water there. So we needed that extra carry ability to get us through.
And just to be clear, there's no roads or anything crossing, so there's no opportunity to cache water ahead of time. It's basically once you're out there, you're out there.
Yeah, exactly. There's no place to camp.
Okay. And then for navigation, you've mentioned paper maps, of course. You've mentioned apps like All Trails and Gaia. Anything else that's particular to navigation that people should be thinking about?
The trail is unmarked, so you don't be looking for blazes or anything like that on the trail.
Despite being unmarked, are there footpaths where you see people have been walking? Is it kind of obvious most of the way, or is it pretty much like you're out there trying to figure it out?
When we were there, it wasn't very obvious at all.
Okay.
We didn't see footprints. The part of we did the hike clockwise, which is the main way that people do it, primarily because there is a dry fall that you would have to. Apparently, it's easier to climb down it than climb up it. So we went that way. But the first 8, almost 9 miles of the hike is on a high clearance 4-wheel drive road
Okay.
before you really get into the canyons. So you're not getting lost in that area at all. I mean, it's extremely rough road, but it's not until you kind of get into the canyon areas that it becomes more difficult to navigate it.
Talk for a moment about the dry fall. What is that, and how is that a challenge as a hiker to deal with?
The dry fall was, I think it may have been listed as something like 15 feet. In the research that we've done, we didn't find it to be quite that high. I mean, a dry fall is basically a dry waterfall. During times when there's flash floods, water will come down there. And so it's in the middle of the canyon with steeper sides on either side. So there's no way to really get around the dry fall without going over it. I don't know who had placed it there, but there was a cottonwood limb, not like a real ladder, but some sort of limb of a tree that was placed up against the dry fall that we were able to climb down there too. It made it a lot easier. We didn't bring any rope. I think in some sources I read that they suggested to bring a length of rope, maybe just to lower packs down. We didn't have to resort to that. It wasn't as intimidating as we thought it might be, but it was definitely a challenge.
Okay. And so, from a logistics perspective, you mentioned doing clockwise as the preferred route because of the dry fall, going down it versus up it.
Mm-hmm.
Also, you have to get permits in advance for this.
During that time period, we were able to just get permits at the ranger station. I think by having looked at the website recently, it looks like you are required to get permits, and the permit period opens up 6 months in advance. I don't know how competitive it is compared to some other backpacking locations because of its remoteness, but it's definitely worth getting that permit in advance if you can.
Did you guys drive straight from Vegas and start the same day, or did you camp out in Death Valley beforehand, or what would you recommend for getting situated in advance of the hike?
We actually stayed outside of the park on the Nevada side in a very small town. We rented an Airbnb, a tiny home for the night, and then went into the park the next morning early.
Okay, and so talk about, I guess let's think about this as a 3-day hike, keeping in mind that people should have enough water in case that third water source is dry.
Mm-hmm.
What are the distances each day, and what are the 2 water sources that are reliable, and what's that third one that may or may not be?
You're saying 2 nights, 3 days?
Yeah, if you had done it to plan and if that third water source had been available.
Then you would still be going probably the first day close to 12 or 13 miles. Now, part of that is that unmaintained road, so it's fairly easy to hike on that. It's not real slow going, even though when you're backpacking, 13 miles can seem like a fair amount of distance. And the best place to camp at night one would be right at Cottonwood Springs. There's another water source that precedes Cottonwood Springs, right where that dirt road sort of meets the trail. There's some water in there, and we were able to fill up water there. And then from there, you've got about another 4 miles to the best water source, which is the actual spring. It's a nice grove of cottonwoods to camp under. That's where the wild horses were hanging out, presumably because there was water there. That point is probably the best point for your night one of camping.
Okay, and then for day 2, what is the location where there could be water, and how far is that?
Yeah, that is at Dead Horse Canyon, which actually intersects the loop at one point. And that is probably about 7 miles from where you camped the first night. And once again, if there was water there, I would probably camp right by the spring. There's another beautiful grove of cottonwoods out there. And if you're doing in winter like we did, it's like fall everywhere else. So all the cottonwoods are yellow and gorgeous at that time of year. So that's probably where I'd spend night too, because you always want to be close to a water source. And that's actually before you get into the Slot Canyon portion of Marble Canyon that next morning. So you stay the night there and then go through, which I consider to be the highlight of the hike, going through the Slot Canyons in Marble Canyon.
So the thing I was just thinking about is what about after the first night, really loading up on water capacity and then just planning to dry camp that second night if there's no water 7 miles up the trail? Would that work?
Yeah, I think it would work if you planned water correctly. I mean, we had the option of doing that, but decided to push on and to the end. So yeah, you could certainly do that if you're willing to dry camp. I can't say that there won't be water there at any other time. It's just there wasn't water there at Dead Horse when we were there.
Yeah, well, the name tells you everything you need to know. Right?
Yeah, exactly. The live horses were the ones that were by the
Cottonwood
Springs. The Dead
Springs,
Horse, there's no water there.
Yeah. All right. And so how much further from, so I didn't do the math in my head yet, but if you get to, it was like 12 of the 13 the first day, 7. So now you're at about 20. So maybe another 10 to the end.
Yeah, it depends if you're able to park right at the beginning of the loop. If you're able to do that, and you have about another 8.
Okay.
And then it would be 10 if you had to park because you couldn't get your car close to the trailhead.
Okay. And it sounds like all of the main attractions like Marble Canyon, Dead Horse Canyon, the Slot Canyon, all of that is part of the route. And there's not like detours you have to take to get to the interesting stuff, or are there sort of side trips that people take while they're on this loop?
We didn't take any side trips. I think you could proceed up Dead Horse Canyon for a ways if you desired to do that. We didn't really do much research on that. I think this is pretty self-contained. It's a nice thing about the hike is that you're going through a lot of varied terrain just on one loop.
And so why do you think people should consider doing this hike versus other hikes that are out there that are similar 3-day weekend kind of winter hikes? Like you could do Joshua Tree, although Joshua Tree is higher up. Well, maybe not. Maybe this is similar altitude as Joshua Tree.
I think it's around the same as Joshua Tree. We looked into that. I've been to Joshua Tree and haven't backpacked there. And Joshua Tree is crowded, for one thing.
Yeah, yeah.
And so this is really an isolated hike. For me, a big part of backpacking is just getting as far away from people as possible.
Yeah, yeah.
That to me would be an advantage that you'd have over something like Joshua Tree. And it's also, anytime you can do a loop hike, it's great because you're not seeing the same terrain twice. I know they always say, well, it looks different from the other direction, which is true, but I prefer not to cover the same ground twice if possible.
Yeah, for me, I mean, I'm actually really intrigued and thinking about doing this next winter or the winter after. Yeah. One of the things that's intriguing to me about it is the fact that it isn't on an established trail. It's an established route, but not an established trail. Yeah. And so I like that because that adds another element of challenge where you have to do extra preparation, some more thinking, some more alertness on the trail. Yeah. And to me, that makes the trail all the more interesting.
Yeah. I agree with everything you said there.
Do you have a particular moment or memory that stands out for you from this hike?
I think it was our first morning after camping at Cottonwood Springs and seeing all these wild horses, which we didn't expect at all. I know they've had problems in the park with, I think, wild burros or donkeys or something. These were definitely horses. In fact, I went back and looked at some video that I took, and they were horses. So, that was really interesting to see.
How were they as far as approaching you guys? Were they comfortable around you guys, or were they keeping their distance?
They were keeping their distance, trying to get to that water source. But maybe 30 yards away is as close as they would get.
So looking back at how you guys did this trip, is there anything that you would advise people to do differently than what you did to make it a little bit better trip or smoother trip?
That's a good question.
Or if you did it again, would you do it the same way or would you do it slightly differently?
I would definitely do it the same direction. And I think if I were to do it again, I would probably do it pretty much the way we did it as far as camping that second night back at the car.
Okay.
If you're strong enough hiker to be able to do half the hike one day and half the hike the next day. Just because, like you mentioned earlier, you're out there by yourself. Your car's there. If it's freezing, you want some heat, you can jump in the car and turn on the heater. You have water. You presumably have extra snacks or whatever in the car, and you can just be a little more comfortable and still being very isolated from the rest of the world.
One thing that strikes me is that doing a sort of cross country type of hike where you're not on an easy to follow trail, doing 17 miles in January in North America is pretty tough because you have limited daylight too. You have limited hours to get it done.
Yeah. We're not generally ones to get up really early in the morning and break down camp and start out, but on this hike, that was definitely something that we had to do just in order to take advantage of the daylight that was there.
So it sounds like I was going to ask you what happened that you didn't expect, but I've noticed a couple of things you said. One is that these wild horses showed up. You probably weren't counting on that.
No.
And the other is that you didn't have water at the last source. And I don't know what you were expecting there. Were you expecting that to be a possibility or was that a surprise?
We were definitely expecting it to be a possibility. If you go to the park website, it lists 3 water sources, but it says the most common one is the Cottonwood Springs, where we saw the horses. But that third one, it says it's seasonal. But this is the time of year when I would think that the season would be best for water, and we didn't have water. So, yeah.
William, thank you for telling me about your hike with your brother on the Cottonwood-Marble Canyon Loop in Death Valley. But while I've got you, I've got a few more questions if you don't mind.
Sure.
What is one piece of gear you don't leave home without?
For me, I tend to be a quilt backpacker as opposed to a sleeping bag. And what I have found invaluable, because quilts can be rather drafty, is they sell a thing called, we call it a silk. It's a cocoon. It's a silk cocoon, like a sleeping bag liner, more or less. The silk ones claim to give you about 10 more degrees in warmth. And so, and it's real small. It folds up like a little, it's a very small piece of equipment, very light. And especially if you're using a quilt, but even with a sleeping bag, having something that's thin and gives you that extra warmth, plus keeps all your body oils and everything off of your sleeping bag. To me, I take that, whether it's a hike in the middle of the summer, because then you could just sleep in that, or in the middle of winter to give you an extra 10 degrees of warmth.
Yeah, I like that. That's interesting. One of the things that I've used with a quilt before are quilt straps that basically strap it underneath your sleeping pad, but that doesn't give you keep your bag as clean and all of that.
I use the straps too, but I'm a side sleeper, and so I'm rolling around quite a bit, and I end up having problems with straps no matter how tight I think I have it around me. It's nice to have a little more layer. My brother, he couldn't be here. His one piece of equipment that he would not go without, and I would second this, is a pee bottle to use in the tent in the middle of the night when it is really cold, like it was at Death Valley, because you get out of that warm sleeping bag to go. It's just better to have a bottle to go in and dump it out the next morning rather than getting out of the tent and freezing and trying to get back into the tent, back into your sleeping bag or quilt. For women, I also backpack with my fiance, and they do sell a funnel sort of thing, which she could attest actually works. So you can use the pee bottle as a female as well. And the pee bottle.
That's great. Gender equality for having the pee bottle. I love it.
Yeah.
One of the things you got to be careful with that is to really mark your pee bottle well so that you're not confusing it with the water bottle later at night.
Yeah. We have
maybe wrap some duct tape.
Dedicated pee bottle with a very tight lid.
Okay.
But it's one of those creature comforts. Plus, the nice thing is if you want to carry a little extra water, you fill up your pee bottle. On the way out, you drink it, and then you have that empty bottle that you use.
Okay.
Because I don't know about you, too, because I'm usually so concerned when hiking in desert conditions of becoming dehydrated that I'm drinking more than I ever would.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe this is too personal, but generally I'm not one who's getting up in the middle of the night to pee at home. But when I'm backpacking, I'm doing it several times a night because of all the water and electrolytes I've been consuming. So we're going off on a real tangent on the pee bottle, but I think it does come in very handy.
All right. What is one hike you've done besides this one that others shouldn't miss out on?
I would say the Teton Crest Trail is a fantastic hike. Really just beautiful alpine scenery, the wildlife. When we did that, we saw moose. We had a black bear in camp. Just a gorgeous hike, kind of on the backside of the Tetons.
Yeah, that sounds like a good one too. And I think by the time this episode comes out, I will have put out an episode on the Teton Crest Trail.
Okay, okay,
That one is coming.
yeah, yeah.
What is the next trip on your list?
We are supposed to be doing the Zion Traverse, partly inspired by your show. Later this month, we're supposed to be doing Zion Traverse. However, we have the permits and everything. I just read today that on the park website that Laverton Creek and Hot Valley, which are part of the trail that goes through Co-op Canyon, are closed currently because of a fire, an early
Oh,
season fire up
wow.
there. So we're hoping that within 10 days they're able to put that fire out and we'll be able to do it. Otherwise, we're going to have to come up with a big plan B.
That should be cool too. I've had several listeners of the show do that hike after hearing the
Mhm.
episode, and all of them have really raved about it. So I hope you have a good time
Yeah,
on that one, and I hope they
yeah,
figure
I'm
out the
sure you
fire
will.
situation.
Hmm.
All right, last question.
Sure.
What is the best campsite or backcountry spot you've ever experienced?
That's a tough one, because a lot of them are great. But I would have to say I went backpacking in the Needles district of the Canyonlands, and in Elephant Canyon, we had a site right up the side of the canyon one night that was so gorgeous. Looking both directions. The Needles is just a spectacular place to begin with. Yeah, it was an amazing sighting. Actually, close to some of the water source too, which is nice when you're out there.
All right, William Armstrong, thank you for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks again to William Armstrong, and I hope that we've inspired you to hike the Cottonwood-Marble Canyon Loop in Death Valley. And if you enjoyed this episode, tell a friend about it. Or better yet, give us a good review on whichever podcast service you use. And keep in mind that this podcast is entertainment and meant to spark your interest. If you decide to hike the trail, do your own research. Like anything else worth doing, outdoor adventure has risk. So when you go, pack your common sense. And when you get back, tell me how it went. Before we go, I also want to remind you to check out a podcast that I learned about that I think you would enjoy. I've mentioned it once before, but I wanted to mention it again. It's called Virginia Outdoor Adventures. It's the ultimate guide for outdoor recreation in Virginia. So if you live in Virginia or within striking distance of Virginia, this is a great resource for you. Host Jessica Bowser keeps things lively and fun and is avid about the outdoors of Virginia. Every episode contains recommendations and info about hiking or kayaking or camping in Virginia. Jessica interviews guests that have a passion for the outdoors in Virginia, and they will definitely inspire you to see what the outdoors of Virginia have to offer. Their 6th season is out now, so some great new episodes are out, including an episode on the Appalachian Trail with an Appalachian Trail historian, an episode on hidden gem adventure towns in Virginia, and even an episode about mushroom foraging. I like the show because Jessica has such an ease with the way she communicates with her guests and delivers the information to you that can help you to enjoy Virginia. So check out Virginia Outdoor Adventures to let me know what you think. I've put a link in the show notes to the website. All right, next time on Trails Worth Hiking, we will be doing something a little different, but I think you're really going to like it. In October, I completed a very personal 4-day hike. I started from my front door, where I live now, and walked more than 30 miles to my mom's house, to the house I grew up in. To get there, I crossed a multitude of urban and urban-adjacent landscapes, including suburban, park space, inner city, quasi-urban, and coastal environments. Even though you wouldn't want to do that hike exactly, at least I wouldn't think you would, you might want to do something similar. Next time on Trails Worth Hiking, we'll talk about how you can design your own urban adventure. That's next time. All right. If you have any questions or feedback on this episode or ideas for future episodes, including if you want to be a guest and talk about a trail that you've hiked, reach out to me at trailsworthhiking@gmail.com. And don't forget to check out our Instagram account and follow us there at Trails Worth Hiking Podcast to see photos of all the hikes we cover, including some great photos from William about the Cottonwood-Marble Canyon Loop. Remember, he's a professional photographer, so there are some really cool photos that he's taken of this hike. So that's it for this time. So start planning your next hike, and before you know it, you'll be on the trail. Thanks for listening.